Hi, and welcome to STAT's virtual event, What Gene-Targeted Therapies Mean for Patients with Cancer, sponsored by AstraZeneca. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Eric Budman, General Assignment Reporter here at STAT. And before we get started, just a few quick housekeeping items. At the bottom of your screen, you should see several icons. Use the chat feature to chat amongst yourselves or to send a message directly to the STAT team, which appears as STAT Events. Please do not put your questions for us in the chat. If you do have a question that you would like to ask one of our featured speakers, please use the Q&A feature to type your question and we will answer it live. In the Q&A window, you should also be able to see the questions that other attendees have asked and upvote the questions you would most like to see answered. We will be taking questions throughout the chat, so please don't wait until the end to submit. This is part of what makes these events unique. Thanks again to you all for being here. Before we get started, I'd like to welcome Camille Hertzka, Vice President and Head of Oncology US Medical at AstraZeneca, for a sponsored introduction of today's event. Take it away, Camille.
Thank you, and good afternoon, everyone. I think I was on mute. So good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for having me today. I'm really excited to be part of this important discussion. In more than 15 years working in oncology, I've seen the tremendous efforts and progress that we've made in how a better understanding of the biology of cancer, combined with innovative approaches in treating cancer, as well as personalized medicine, have transformed the way we treat patients and the impact it makes on their lives. Today is the 8th of April, and it has a special meaning to me. It would have been my mother's birthday today. She passed away 10 years ago from lung cancer. And when she was diagnosed, she was at a very advanced stage of her disease. And at the time, there were very few treatment options for her. I wish my mother has been screened regularly due to her cancer risk factors, and therefore diagnosed earlier when cure was still possible. I wish we were able to identify a mutation or an abnormality in her tumor or something that we could target. And I wish my mother could have been really benefiting from all the treatments we have today. And since then, we have come a long way in our understanding of non-small cell lung cancer and how to treat it. And I'm proud to work for AstraZeneca, where we have been focusing for many years now on lung cancer and on developing a precision medicine approach using groundbreaking science to further understand the disease and deliver medicines to the patient who are the most likely to benefit from them. Through biomarker testing, we can now look at the thumbprint of each patient's tumor, its unique characteristics, including specific genetic mutations or some alterations on the tumor. Doctor can then use this information to determine the best treatment options for each patient, targeting their own specific tumor's drivers. We still have a lot to learn in this area, and we don't have yet a target for all subtypes of lung cancer. However, we've made incredible progress over the past years, and this is really giving us a lot of hope for the future. For example, our research has led us to dramatically improve the outcome of patients with mutations in the epidermal growth factor receptor that we call EGFR, which occurs in approximately 20% of patients with non-small cell lung cancer in the US. And the identification of the EGFR mutation has been really a stepping stone in the introduction of precision medicine in lung cancer. AstraZeneca was one of the first companies to understand the importance of this pathway and to develop a targeted therapy, the first generation of a small molecule targeting EGFR mutations. Our research teams then built on this initial success and created another targeted therapy, a newer generation of EGFR inhibitor, which was even more active against EGFR mutated tumors. And these targeted therapies, along with others which have been developed since, targeting other mutations or other alterations, such as ALK or ROS, for example, have really transformed treatment and outcomes for many patients with advanced lung cancer. We've also seen the introduction of immunotherapy, aiming to reactivate a person's own immune system to fight the cancer. And that's another really important breakthrough. As I mentioned previously, the earlier the patients are diagnosed in the course of their disease, the greater is their chance for cure. In this context, developing better treatment options for early stage patients is a critical step to one day eliminate lung cancer as a cause of death. And we've seen recently the FDA approval of one of these new approaches. With the ADORA phase 3 clinical trial, we learned that the use of this anti-EGFR after surgery in patients with resectable non-small cell lung cancer harboring an EGFR mutation reduced by 80% the risk of the lung cancer coming back. These recent advances reinforce the importance of optimal lung cancer screening, as well as biomarker testing, which is now a critical element to enable optimal care of patients with lung cancer. So looking ahead, we need to continue to work to understand resistance mechanisms and emerging biomarkers or new targets. So for example, this could include antibody drug conjugates, as we call them ADCs, which is a new approach to target an actionable biomarker, such as HER2 or TROP2, for example. And this extremely innovative approach aims to use these markers, these two targets that I mentioned, for example, TROP2 and HER2, to bring the chemotherapy directly where the tumor is, to increase efficacy, and at the same time limit some side effects that could be associated with chemotherapy, usually when it's given in a more general way. And so we are also looking at other gene alterations, such as METs, for example, which we know could potentially be an approach to offer more options for patients whose lung cancer has progressed or is progressing despite the treatments that we're giving those patients today. It's a very exciting time to be working at AstraZeneca as we see the benefit of our work for patients, and we continue to search for new options to address unmet medical needs in lung cancer. We take each step as a victory, and we move step after step, one victory after another one, and we won't stop until we've eliminated cancer as a cause of death. And maybe just before handing over to you, I wanted to add that the pandemic had really an impact on all of us in different ways, but it has had a lot of impact on cancer diagnosis as well. And I wanted to highlight this because we see a terrible decline in cancer diagnosis today. And it's not because there are fewer patients with cancer, but it's rather because they are going undiagnosed. So it's critically important that we all stay alert and we ensure that we don't delay screening, we don't postpone too much doctor's appointments that are already scheduled, and we consult in case of any symptoms. With that, I'd like to turn it over to Eric, and I wish you a very good panel discussion.
Thank you so much, Camille. And with that, I would love to introduce our speakers. There are two patient advocates and lung cancer survivors, as well as two clinicians, to discuss targeted treatments for cancers with specific mutations and how these treatments have impacted patients. Please welcome Bonnie Jayadario, lung cancer survivor, co-founder and board chair of the GO2 Foundation for Lung Cancer, Dr. Narjis Duma, assistant professor of medicine and thoracic oncology at the University of Wisconsin Carbone Cancer Center, Janet Freeman Daly, co-founder and board chair of the Ross Wonders and a stage 4 lung cancer survivor and research advocate, and Dr. Laura Petrillo, palliative care physician at Massachusetts General Hospital and Harvard Medical School. Thank you all so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
So I actually wanted to start our discussion today with you, Janet. I know that targeted therapies have had quite a big impact in your own life, and I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about that.
Thanks, Eric. I was diagnosed with stage 3A non-small cell lung cancer, which was considered curable in May of 2011. However, I had 2 lines of chemo and radiation treatments, and each time I stopped treatment, the tumor would grow again. I had been tested for the known biomarkers at the time, which were just EGFR and ALK, but I was negative for both. However, after my second line of treatment, because of my participation in an online patient community, I learned about biomarker testing and clinical trials, and that there was a new biomarker called ROS1, and was able to get myself tested and got on a clinical trial for a targeted therapy drug. I started that trial in November of 2012. And I have had no evidence of disease ever since, over 8 years. I'm a big fan of targeted therapy.
Thank you so much. I mean, that's an amazing story. And I did want to turn it over to you, Dr. Petrillo. I'm curious to hear how targeted therapies have sort of changed the conversations that you're having with lung cancer patients.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think it's an incredibly hopeful and wonderful time, as Camille was saying, with so many incredible treatments for lung cancer and for many different types of cancers that are molecularly targeted to the changes that we know make cancer grow. And I think one of the big things that comes with these changes and things changing so rapidly is uncertainty. And so I think one thing that has shifted in how at least within palliative care, we speak with patients and families who are learning about a cancer diagnosis, is acknowledging that that uncertainty is there and that things are changing so quickly. We do encourage people to be talking with others and learning as much as possible about their illness, but supporting people in thinking about how to manage that uncertainty about how things will change, and be advocates for themselves to learn about clinical trials and treatment options and kind of support them in their learning is one aspect that's really changing. And I would say the other clear thing is that people are living longer, which is so fantastic. I think when we had thought about lung cancer 10 years ago, as Camille was saying with her mother, the prognosis was really quite different, and the way that we approached treatment was quite different, the types of treatments that we used. And so now with people living longer with specifically with advanced cancer, there really are some new challenges that people are facing in kind of managing that uncertainty and understanding how to live as well as possible. And for anyone who's not aware of palliative care, our focus is just to help support people in living as well as possible and managing symptoms and providing an extra layer of support. And I'm happy to talk more about that if there are any questions.
Thank you so much. And so, Bonnie, I'm curious from your perspective, you've spent a long time as a patient advocate, and I'm sort of curious what those shifts that Dr. Petrillo was just telling us about have meant in your work and what you're hearing from other patients.
Well, it's given patients hope where they really haven't had much hope, in the last 5 decades. But to give you a measurement of the progress that's taking place in the last 5 to 10 years, more new drugs and therapies have happened in that decade than the last 5 decades. So the progress is absolutely amazing. But one thing we really have to work very hard on is the testing of patients to see if they have a marker that works well with a targeted drug. The problem is today in the community, especially if a patient gets testing for targeted markers, it's not always a complete panel. Sometimes it's for 1 or 2 markers, usually the most popular, which are the biggest ones, which are EGFR and ALK. We have to get patients tested for all the available markers to match up with treatments so they get it first line. Because if they don't get the treatment first line, that could make a huge difference, which Janet just hit on in their therapy. So it's a big deal for us to start working on in a big way.
Thank you. And Dr. Duma, it looked like you were about to respond to that idea.
So I agree with Bonnie. There's a big challenge about some of patients not getting tested. And why is that a big deal? Because we are cutting our patients' life by significantly. It's not like a week or a month. We're talking about years and also their quality of life. Patients that have target mutations are able to be in pills, and the adverse events the side effects tend to be more tolerable than some of the chemotherapy. Doesn't mean the patient will not get chemotherapy later, but it's always, and it should be, that the targeted therapy is first line. Yes, there are new exciting new drugs like immunotherapy, but if we do the sequencing wrong, if the patient goes in immunotherapy and then it goes in the target therapy, it's toxic. So we have to do it right for each patient. And is that if the patient has a target mutation, it means a mutation for which we have a drug, that is the preferred treatment. And it's important to mention that not all mutations are FDA approved. And when the field is evolving rapidly. So it's always important to discuss with your doctor what clinical trial may be available for that mutation too. Because Janet just shared her story, and that happens a lot. And we are evolving so fast. There are 4 or 5 mutations that are in very large studies right now that you can access the drugs. So if it's not the famous one, doesn't mean it's not the right one. And also doing next gene sequencing, that was Bonnie was doing, saying, but next gene sequencing is like we look for any gene and any mutation. And that's the preferred approach. You use less tissue, it's more cost effective, and you're more likely to find a mutation. So everybody, like almost all patients with lung cancer, should get some type of biomarker testing.
So, Janet, I'm wondering if you can sort of talk a little bit about the challenges that you're seeing that Dr. Duma just brought up about folks not actually necessarily having access to these sorts of tests or to complete panels of testing.
Yes, I am active in a group called the ROS1ders, which is an international group of patients with ROS1. And access to these drugs is really inconsistent. Just from my own experience, I recently moved from commercial experience through a business to Medicare. And on my commercial insurance, I would pay a total of $156 a year copay for my drug. On Medicare, I would pay almost $16,000. That's out of reach for a lot of people. We all ought to be able to access these drugs that make a huge difference, but cost is an issue. And there are countries that don't have access to the drugs that are standard of care in the US. There's also an issue with doctors not being aware of what the appropriate tests and the appropriate drugs are. Lung cancer is diagnosed not just by lung cancer specialists, but by general medical oncologists, by primary care doctors. And lung cancer research is moving so fast, as Bonnie mentioned, that it's almost impossible for the lung cancer experts to keep up, much less the other people that have to track a lot of other cancers. So we have people coming into the group that received the wrong drug. We have people coming into the group who received immunotherapy instead of a targeted therapy. We have people whose doctors have never seen a ROS1 patient. It's my particular mutation or rearrangement is relatively rare. And these are all issues that we have. If the doctors don't do the broad panel testing, they're not going to catch all of the potential targets that a patient might have. And at the moment, correct me if I'm wrong, doctors, but about half of patients with non-small cell lung cancer have some kind of targetable drug available to them, either FDA approved or in advanced clinical trials. If you don't test for the broad panel, you're not necessarily going to find the right treatment.
So I'm going to jump in with a question from a listener that's sort of related to that, or I guess if we're sort of assuming that folks have been tested and are on a targeted treatment, one listener was asking that, he says, my wife was diagnosed with stage 4 lung cancer in 2019 and is asymptomatic, started with alectinib tab and now shifted to lorlatinib tab after some renal problems. No symptoms or major side effects till now. How long should she continue the tablets? And I feel like this is a good question for you, Dr. Duma.
So for patients that have mutations like ALK, ROS, and all that, we continue the therapy until the therapy becomes too toxic, or the disease, not the patient, the disease grows in the therapy. But I'm going to put a big star on that. As we have evolved and see these new drugs, I have seen patients that have a complete response, which means all the cancer has gone, or there is no evidence of disease. So I think it's very patient specific. I don't know the details about the patient, but if the disease is under control and the patient has tolerated the drug, we keep the medication. But big star on it is very patient specific, and it has to follow the goals of the patients and the goals of the family. Because I have patients that have been in ALK therapy that we took a break. It is challenging because sometimes the disease can come back and it may be hard to treat again. So we have to have a discuss or risk over benefits. They have to have that with their oncologist, because it's a risk that the disease may become resistant later. But it is a possibility if the patient's on it for many years to take a break if it's not tolerated. But usually patients stay on the pill for as long as they can tolerate it or the therapy is responded. The tumor is responded to the therapy.
And this is the situation that I'm in, having been no evidence of disease on this drug for a long time. And I've had that discussion with my oncologist. The fact is, we don't have any data to say whether or not this is the right or wrong thing to do. We have two things to go by. One, the patients who went on Gleevec, the first targeted therapy for a different cancer, that became approved around 2000, 2001. So they've had it a long time. And some of those people have tried going off the drug. The disease almost always comes back, but it might be 3 years later. The other thing we have is there was a group of patients with the EGFR mutation who were no evidence of disease after treatment, and they'd all not had any signs of cancer on their scans for a year. So they tried going off the drug, and all of them recurred within a year. So we know that the disease will most likely come back. I'm staying on my drug.
I'd like to add something to what everybody just said. One of the things we promote all the time to patients is that, and to physicians, and that's one size does not fit all. Every patient is very, very unique, and they have a very unique disease. Even adding in, a targeted marker and a potential fix for that. We always talk about, you remember the old days when doctors came to your house and they brought their little suitcase full of things to treat you. I'm actually old enough to remember that happening. We need to use all the tools in the box. We need to do genomic profiling, without a doubt. I like to use comprehensive genomic profiling, because what that means is you're going to use the complete test, not just part of the test. And that's what comprehensive means. But we also have to make sure that they've had the other testing, the MRIs before treatment starts, and even at progression. You need to constantly be using all the tools in the box, because it's not just about a targeted marker. It's about all the other things that need to happen when you're first diagnosed and upon progression. So all the tools in the box, one size does not fit all.
Patients have a variety of side effects, and palliative care can address that. Dr. Petrillo is one of the experts on that.
Thanks so much for the handoff. So I agree, Janet. Thank you for acknowledging that, and Bonnie, thank you also for talking about all the tools in the box, because I think absolutely all of the next generation sequencing to determine the proper therapy, but then also thinking about all of the different complementary tools that people can have to live as well as possible while receiving therapy, because health is not just about managing cancer and keeping cancer cells in check. It's also about all the other things that help us be well. And so thinking about things like nutrition and stress management and some of these things that we didn't necessarily think about when someone had a diagnosis that would be maybe changing rapidly in 3 to 6 months time. The kind of way that something happened, the way that we would talk about nutrition would be different than somebody living for several years time and trying to think about what are the best foods to eat. When we're not just thinking about kind of weight gain, for example, to try and maintain weight, or thinking about mood and how that affects people's experience going through their cancer treatment, and thinking about the family and providing support to caregivers and understanding what it's like to go through all these things. And I know Dr. Duma has done research and thought a lot about financial toxicity and what it's like to be long-term on therapies. And I think that this is a huge impact on quality of life. And so thinking about all the different tools, all the different services and supports that patients can have for managing all the different aspects of their health, and symptoms too is absolutely part of it. So symptoms from cancer are usually less of an issue when cancer is under good control with targeted therapies, but side effects from therapies and the cumulative effects of therapies over time are absolutely something that we hope to address in a kind of comprehensive way.
And to Laura's point, people think palliative care shouldn't enter the patient's life until the end. it should come in at the beginning. Palliative care should be part of the multidisciplinary team that actually, when the patient is first diagnosed, they gather. And now you have all these eyes looking at the patient's potential therapy and treatment from the very, very beginning. And palliative care is, equally as important as all those other opinions.
We're so glad to be part of the team.
Yeah.
Yes. And actually, there's a listener question about exactly that. So I do want to put it in here. This listener is asking, with the advent of newer cancer drugs, do you see a delay or a decrease in referrals to palliative care, and how is that changing the conversation?
Yeah, it's a great question. I don't think we have hard numbers on that, but I would say, palliative care generally, similar to the kind of discoveries in the last decade in cancer treatment, there's been a lot of research demonstrating the value of the addition of palliative care from the time of diagnosis for patients with advanced cancer. And there's even guidelines kind of recommending it for all patients. There is an enormous shortage of kind of palliative care specialists. So I think a lot of the way that our field is thinking about it is how to get as many people as possible these kinds of services, and how to provide education around primary palliative care. So teaching clinicians to do palliative care, whether it's primary care doctors, oncology teams, and trying to just build out that approach to care. And so I would say, with regard to kind of the hopeful new medicines in kind of some of these different spaces like lung cancer, anecdotally, it is sometimes, I think it's less at the top of someone's mind if a patient is not having symptoms, for example, or they're not losing function very quickly, or if we see a person with a life expectancy that's on the several years time frame, someone might not think of palliative care in the same way. And I think we had been making a lot of strides in thinking about integration of palliative care early on, and I would say that this is a space where maybe it might be a little bit slower to think about that. But I really challenge us within the field of palliative care and just within oncology in general to think about ways that we can support patients, because this is really our role, to improve quality of life. And the best time, I think, to do that is actually from the get-go, and helping people with adjusting to their diagnosis, and thinking about ways to to cope with the stresses that come up, and then thinking about all these healthy lifestyle behaviors. And so I think this really is a shift, though, to think about some of these things that are more usually in the survivorship realm. I think we always are trying to think about quality of life, but it just looks different at different stages of the cancer trajectory. And I would say with these longer trajectories, it looks different still.
Well, and thank you for mentioning survivorship. For years, lung cancer, especially since the average patient would die within a year, was never really considered for survivorship. We didn't get survivorship plans. When I actually approached my community hospital for one, they weren't sure what to do with me. And there's still not a lot out there that's available because there were such a small number of lung cancer survivors. So having that information would be really useful. There's a lot of doctors out there that still aren't familiar with the common side effects that a lot of these TKIs have. My pulmonologist was going to give me a heart check when he saw all the edema, the water retention in my legs, until I could show him information that showed that's really common. So I wonder if Dr. Duma could talk a little bit about that and the disconnect when there's so many doctors who aren't familiar with these drugs.
So I think it's very important. I agree with you, Janet. And this is one of the things I focus is about lung cancer survivorship, because it is not a new concept, but it's a new concept to a lot of people in medicine. And the unique aspects of lung cancer survivorship should not come from other disease or other patients than patients for lung cancer. So what we have done, because of the lack of the data, is we extrapolate data from other tumors and other patients, which have very different needs. And the adverse events of the targeted therapy drugs are adverse events that do not follow the book for chemotherapy, right? We see weight gain with these drugs, which usually is something that we didn't have before, right? We see things like sexual dysfunction, which is an aspect that I study in patients with lung cancer. The financial toxicity is also a side effect. I consider it a side effect when you have to pay so much for your drug that's keeping the tumor at bay. And so we need to stop using data from other tumors. We need to generate our own data, and we need to have awareness for the doctors and the ER, the primary care doctor, the patients with lung cancer are living years and are living a full life. I often find myself on the phone, and my patients are what motivates me to do everything I do in academia. And I find myself on the phone talking to a ER doctor, like, no. She has an mutated lung cancer. Don't start calling like hospice. She's gonna do fine. Let me walk you through this. And that's just, my patient's like, why did he wants to call hospice? It's like, no, we're gonna figure it out this together. But I'm doing it one doctor at a time, and we need all of you to increase the awareness about lung cancer survivorship. And there's patients running marathons. My patients are running marathons and pills, taking their pills.
Well, another aspect that the patients are dealing with is acquired resistance. These drugs don't work forever. Eventually, the body figures a way around it and makes the cancer start growing again. And it varies widely depending on what type of targeted therapy you're on and what type of gene alteration you have as to what your options are. That would I'd really like to hear some discussion about what to do about that, because a lot of the patients, again, with the rarer oncogenes like ROS1 and RET and BRAF, et cetera, the doctors may have never seen another patient with it. And when a patient progresses, they don't know what to do. What would you suggest to them?
So what I always believe in is to start from zero. I no start from zero. It's like, okay, the cancer is growing. Do you have a target mutation? We need to learn what's happening right now, because your genetic testing for 2 years ago or 8 years ago is different. Cancer evolves over time. So all my patients at diagnosis, and as we continue to follow up, I prepare them to know that we're going to do a biopsy when the tumor grows, because we need to find out if there's a resistant mechanism that we can target to another pill. Patients with EGFR mutations may have a MET mutation, and sometimes I can add the MET medication with the EGFR, because we know immunotherapy doesn't work great for patients with target mutations. And it helps us learn what mutation is out here now. How is the cancer growing? Is there a clinical trial? And for a subgroup of patients, and I think this is very important, for EGFR patients, we are learning that the cancer can completely transform to a different type of lung cancer. In that case, that's a medical emergency. But if you don't do a biopsy, you won't figure it out. And somebody was mentioned about liquid biopsies, and liquid biopsies have been very helpful. This is when the cancer DNA is taken out of the plasma or the blood to look for mutations. We get most likely in patients that have metastatic disease, so the cancer has traveled to another organ, and allows to find mutations via the blood, and also to understand how the cancer is evolving over time. For some of my patients, I do sequential liquid biopsies to learn if any clone, which is a different type of mutation, may be coming out. So to summarize what I just said, when the patient with a target mutation, the disease has progression, the tumor is growing, I always, if possible, do a biopsy. Depends on the site where the disease is progressing. It can be a biopsy of the tissue, or it can be a liquid biopsy, or it can be both. Because we need to learn what we're dealing with now. Because whatever was 8 years ago is evolving and is growing.
Yeah. And to add to what Dr. Duma just said, we always use the analogy when upon progression, that it's like a bus driver that has to stop and a new bus driver has to get on. We need to find out what's driving the cancer now upon progression, and do all of those other tests as well. Because again, every lung cancer is very, very unique. Lung cancer today is driving the medical world in the way of mutations. It's the most mutated cancer out there than any others, and it's very complicated. So to make it simple, upon progression, you have to find out what's driving the cancer now. And to Dr. Duma's point, we've seen EGFRs mutate to something else. We've seen ROS1s mutate to something else. And the question, though, is how do we get all of this knowledge out to the community docs? Where do they go to learn all of these things and all of the ways that are necessary to treat the patients? How do we do that?
And I think it's important to note also that there's the guidelines put up by the National Comprehensive Cancer Network explain what drugs to try and what sequence. It used to be, 10 years ago, they would update the guidelines once every 5 years. Now they're updating it 5 times a year. Things are changing so fast. So it really pays to check the guidelines if you have a patient with one of these gene alterations.
But you have to test them first and find out what marker they have. Otherwise, the guidelines don't help.
Yes.
And so, we've talked a lot about this sort of intensive re-upping of care and bringing together many kinds of care. And one of the questions that a few listeners have brought up is, how do you actually work to make that sort of intensive care is the wrong way to put it, but that kind of comprehensive care accessible to people without means? And so how do we actually expand access given the financial toxicity of a complex disease?
I think one of the things, there's many things that we address that question. There's like half of my lab focuses on that question.
Yeah.
I think the cheapest way is education, like educate patients that there are many resources that can be explored. I think a lot of my patients have never met a social worker until all my patients meet with a social worker. Hey, this is this foundation, there is this group. How can we do this? Let's do. These Medicaid and Medicare applications are extremely complicated. Like I have sit down with patients to fill it out. I have an ND and I still have to call the social worker, say, what do you fill out here? So resources, how can you help patients connect with social work, connect with foundations and patient-oriented groups? I have learned so much for these patient-oriented groups like the Ross Wonders, the EGFR. Like I learned about witch hazel last week from one of the participants in the patient disease group. So resources that are not that expensive. Hey, can you talk to your grandma or talk to your granddaughter? Let's open a Facebook account and connect with the Ross Wonders, connect to the positive. So there's a lot of resources for that. And my last thing about that is that everybody can advocate. You can advocate to the policymakers, you can advocate in your own hospital. And it really is hard for a patient that's just diagnosed with lung cancer to ask them to advocate. But it unfortunately is necessary because the healthcare system is complicated for patients and the priority is no patients. So I think that would be my 2 things: connect with resources and advocate. And don't be afraid to say what you think and what you need. I tell my patient, what's going on? Let's figure it out. Like parking. If parking is too much, we validate parking in my institution. For another institution, it's $30 a day. So how can I validate parking? That's something that you can advocate for yourself and save the $30, which is a lot of money.
Dr. Petrillo, I wanted to hand it over to you. I'm curious, how do you think about expanding access to palliative care for these patients?
Ooh, that's such a wonderful question. I mean, I think that it is something where understanding the supportive care needs and then developing systems where kind of supportive care is integrated early will require a number of different kind of professionals from different disciplines and teams. And so I think every center actually has different sort of approaches to this. I'm pleased to hear Dr. Duma integrates a social worker immediately. I think social workers can provide so much support. And there are places that do kind of automatically refer their patients. And I've heard this from a lot of patients and caregivers that sometimes you don't know what you don't know. So you don't know what you might need kind of a number of weeks down the line or months down the line. And so kind of the more that things can be sort of offered and integrated for patients early on in the course of their cancer experience, the better. So I do think, I also am a fan of kind of advocating for better policy. We have on the federal level policies to expand palliative care education and access, to increase training about symptom management and pain management and things like that for all kinds of clinicians, and also to increase the training of the workforce, just to get more of this, more specialists who are able, but I think also kind of sharing across a team and kind of within individual centers and building those teams out. And then I certainly agree that that people can ask themselves. So there's a website called getpalliativecare.org where you can find a palliative care specialist near you. And so if it hasn't been brought up and it's something that you or a loved one might be able to benefit from, go on the website and look for a clinician or ask your team about it.
I think,
go ahead.
I totally agree. But I think, we have to look at the underserved too and how we get to them. That's
Yes.
a huge portion of all cancer and all disease, not just lung. We've learned so many silver linings have come from COVID. So many have come from COVID. We really all need to get together and share what we've learned, getting access to patients and getting the right vaccinations to the right people and the right testing to the right people. Telehealth is going to be a huge part of going into the next phase of how we treat lung cancer. I had a call myself yesterday with the pulmonologist. In 10 minutes, got everything I needed. Didn't have to get in a car, didn't have to drive anywhere, didn't cost anything. There's a small fee that right now the insurance companies are paying for telemedicine, but they might not continue paying when COVID is over. So it's up to us to all work together to get those things, back in place and working. But so many things, clinical trials. We've had our foundation has a couple trials going on. We're doing blood draws in people's homes, sending phlebotomists out to their houses. Don't say no, we can't. We can. We all need to sit together and work together and find the best possible road to that patient to get them what they need. We've got a community hospital out in Kentucky that has a mobile CT scanner, and they're just getting ready to go hit the road. And why not? And then they can use it at a Walmart somewhere as well and get people to come in there. Not everybody has a car. Not everybody has insurance. Not everybody has access. You need a laptop to access the internet, so we have to work together and find the best path for patients.
On that note about sort of the barriers and making sure that we do find the best path for patients, I'm wondering sort of, we talked about getting more access to biomarker testing for more biomarkers. And Janet, I feel like this is a good question for you. What do you feel like needs to happen in order to actually make that occur for to expand the panel that patients have access to?
Boy, I wish I had a good answer for you on that. I would love to be able to say social media will take care of it, but the reality is the people that are online in social media in these oncogene groups tend to skew white, they tend to skew female, they tend to skew younger, and it's not really representative of the patient population. I'd love to say that all the doctors will keep up with it, but that's not happening either. So it's a tough nut to crack. I don't think there's an obvious answer. We need to somehow get more information to more people. I think it might help for some of the doctors in the community setting to learn more about the huge difference these targeted therapies are making for so many patients. One of the studies on my particular cancer found that the people who are taking our original first drug, crizotinib, lived an average of 6 years, when our original life expectancy was less than 1. I mean, that's huge, but how do we get that message out? And I don't know that I have a good answer. I know there are some people working on it. The Count Me In project at the Broad Institute is working on patient-partnered research, and they just started a project to try and find how to get more information about cancer treatment to a more diverse population. But I don't have any pat answers for you.
And
this is something that needs addressing on every level, because even the genetic tests that we do, our genomic information is driven by the research studies to describe genomic alterations are largely done in white populations too. So even understanding what the mutations are across the broader population of patients. But I completely agree, thinking about holistic services, thinking about kind of how to provide that type of care for patients if patients can't even get to the therapies in the first place. So I think things like kind of reflexive testing for for biomarkers when patients get their pathology done, so that it's not on the provider to remember, and education. Things like Project Echo that have been really helpful for hepatitis, to have kind of a hub and spoke sort of a model of teaching and collaboration. I know there are websites where tumor boards are broadcast so that people in the community, clinicians in the community, can learn. So I think every level needs kind of education and access increase. And I think that it's going to take a variety of different modalities.
There's also a trust issue, with various different ethnic groups, and we need to find out, because they're not listening to their doctors. They're not listening to us. They're afraid. They don't trust the system to get them the right information and the right drug. But we have to go to where they go. Who do they listen to? Their church leader, and get those people on the team. So they're the ones communicating as well out to these networks. But if they're uninsured, who's going to take them on? How do we get them? We have to make care affordable. We have to make testing affordable. It all has to be affordable and doable. We can come up with all kinds of great ideas, but if they're not doable and no one's going to pay for them.
So, and just to build on that just a little bit, some of the healthcare plans limit which hospitals you can go to. There are only a few experts in ROS1 in the US, and they're pretty much all at the academic cancer centers. If your insurance doesn't allow you to go there, how do you find a doctor who knows how to treat you?
Right.
And that's a great point. And there's actually sort of a related question that's a little bit more technical that I wanted to address to Dr. Duma, that a number of listeners have brought up, about how immunotherapy and targeted therapies should or can work together. And also, I think, if we go to the research side of things, where should researchers be focusing in order to actually move lung cancer forward?
So the first thing is that why immunotherapy is incited, and it's one of the commercials. There was a commercial on the Super Bowl. Patients with target mutation need to go on their target pills. That's the comment. Like, that's the most important things. Data mostly retrospected in one clinical trial that was actually closed early because there was no benefit for those patients with EGFR. Immunotherapy doesn't work greatly in most patients with target mutation. There are a subgroup of patients that may work, like the patients with a KRAS mutation and a BRAF mutation. But the majority of patients with a mutation, it does not work. And placing a patient in immunotherapy before the pill can be very toxic when you try to restart the pill. So what happened with resistance, which Janet mentioned? So when the target therapy stops working, when the therapy fails the patient never fails a therapy. The therapy fails our patients. When that happens, we tend to incorporate immunotherapy with chemotherapy together, because immunotherapy alone is not enough for the majority of patients with target mutations. There is new data about adding the immunotherapy before surgery or adding immunotherapy after surgery. So we're still learning a lot about immunotherapy in patients with target mutation. But the most important point, it should not substitute the target agent. Never. Should not do that. Always target a pill first.
And I think we're in a lung cancer space, so that absolutely applies, but there are other settings where kind of targeted therapies and immunotherapies are used together, like in renal cancer or in melanoma. It can be kind of going back and forth. So just to qualify that this is sort of a lung cancer focused panel, but and I also wanted to bring up on that point too about chemotherapy. I think this is something that we encounter a lot, that after somebody's been on a targeted therapy drug for a number of years, it can be really hard to think about a transition to kind of the blunt instrument of chemotherapy, because being in this time frame, it's like, we're in a new world now. We have targeted pills that don't have as many side effects. And then to make a transition towards a chemotherapy patient, there are often patients who say, I don't even want to try that. It's kind of too toxic. It might not be tolerable for me. And I think normalizing that is still an effective instrument in our arsenal, and maybe part of the therapy plan for people, I think, is an important message.
And navigating treatment is a huge issue, because a lot of us that are in the rare oncogenes may have one or no approved therapies. So clinical trials is our only option. And when the targeted therapy starts working, where do you go from there? Without doing the biopsy, you don't know whether or not a targeted therapy might work or whether you have to go to chemo. Another consideration that comes up is that on some trials, if you've already had one TKI and you add chemo, you become ineligible for the next clinical trial. And this is a major issue for patients trying to figure out what their next step would be. There's some patients that bridge with chemo for a period of time so that their tumor will hopefully stay under control. But some of us are in a really weird spot where we actually have to wish our tumor will grow just a little more so we can get into a clinical trial. It's a very weird life once you finish and the TKIs no longer work for you.
Bonnie, it looked like you wanted to jump in.
I did. I just wanted to say that, we really need to do a lot of work on talking about the fact that chemotherapy really still is a good drug, given at the right time, for the right patient. So much damage has, and negative discussions around chemotherapy that the patients are afraid of it. And it's what boosts immunotherapy more often than not. When you put chemo and immunotherapy together, it works so much better than either one of them works alone. So education is such a huge part of this whole process for patients to get the right story, at the very beginning of their therapy, and not have too much information, because too much, you see these commercials on TV for immunotherapy, and of course everybody watching that wants it, but they don't really understand that it's not for everyone. It's just for a certain amount of patients. So education is key. At the very beginning, when the patient is sitting at your desk, the right information at the right time is equally as good as the right drug at the right time.
And I want to back that up. Oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
I just want to back that up, that it is important that we continue to educate patients during the several encounters. So when my patient comes back, so the first visit is like, hi, I'm Dr. Duma, let's do all this genetic testing. I need more time in the second visit than the first visit, because the second visit is like, let's talk about the plan and let's talk about this. And the education continues and the assessments continues. And to anybody who's hearing, if you have any side effects, talk to your doctor, because I often feel my patients deal with the side effects because it's the price of having a target mutation. Like, I'm lucky to have this. And there's many things we can do for some of the side effects, not all of them. But if we don't talk about it, it would be hard to find a solution for a problem that I don't know of.
It's also important to note that targeted therapies are still young and there's still a lot we're learning about them. We have now 2 different first-line drugs approved for ROS1, and some patients like me will do great on crizotinib, and others have horrible side effects. But that doesn't mean they can't try a different targeted therapy. Sometimes these drugs will hit more than one target in the body, and that can be a source of side effects. Every patient is unique. So to reinforce what Dr. Dumas said, it's important to tell the doctor what you're experiencing and the side effects you're having. They could help you change to a different targeted therapy that will be either more tolerable or more effective for you. And Eric, I noticed there was a question about research, if I can just address that briefly. The Ross Wonders actually did a roundtable last year to talk about what research can we do to drive our particular mutation, because there's not many researchers and there's not a lot out there. But the reality is that a lot of these targets develop this acquired resistance in similar ways. And there's an option to try and look at several of these different targeted therapies at once to see if there are common ways that they develop resistance that make it easier to do the research rather than trying to do research in a very small slice. We could group several of these together.
Thank you so much. And thank you for bringing up the question about research. It's something I've had at the back of my mind. And I just want to ask one more question, and then I'm going to have to cut us off. I feel like there's a lot of hope that we've talked about, but also that there are a lot of issues to be untangled. And Dr. Petrillo, I'm just wondering, just briefly, what do you think needs to happen in those cases where the sort of hope of the current moment has sort of not played out?
So I think one thing to just acknowledge in medicine in general, we always are wondering and putting very first in our kind of mind what's most important to someone in their treatment. And so kind of the sooner that we're having conversations about what the goal is, I think we very often will have an assumption that the goal is survival. You know, if somebody comes in with a ruptured appendix, goal is survival. Nobody has to talk about it and have that kind of conversation. But I think that with serious illness, it is always really helpful to understand what people understand about their illness, what they're hoping for, what they're worried about, what their goals are, and make sure that we're all always on the same page about that, and acknowledging that those goals can change over time. They can change based on kind of what the burdens of treatment are, or how the illness is making somebody feel about circumstances in someone's life. And so kind of always kind of bringing it back to what's most important to the person going through this and to them in the context of their lives. I think that's always a good kind of grounding place to be. And I think we are so thrilled to have these incredibly hopeful medications. And also there will be times when patients with advanced cancer who benefit from these therapies, when their health does change, and kind of keeping that focus on the person and their what's important to them kind of all throughout makes that transition feel natural when things do change in that regard. 'Cause sometimes we sort of are focused on kind of length of life, and then suddenly we're talking about quality of life, and it can be jarring for people. We should be talking about quality of life all throughout the course of someone's experience. And so then just as things shift, that's still front and center.
Well, thank you so much. That's such an important reminder. And I wish we could keep talking about all of this stuff, because there are so many ideas and questions that I'd love to still get to. But I do see that folks are kind of dropping off. And so I think we should probably wrap up. But thank you so much to AstraZeneca and Camille for sponsoring this event. And Bonnie, Narjust, Janet, and Laura, thank you so much for taking the time to share your expertise with us. I really, really appreciate it. And to all of you out there, thanks for asking some great questions. And please keep an eye out for our Health Tech Summit, which will take place virtually on May 11th and 12th. More information can be found on our website. Be sure to sign up to join us. Until then, stay safe, and thank you all again.
Thank you very much.
Thank you
Thanks
all.
so much.